Afternoon, Dr. Von Gernert.
Good afternoon, Mr. Schachter.
No, don't worry about it.
Dr. Von Gernert, just to proceed on, we were looking at, before the lunch break, a number of documents trying to understand what they can tell us about what the Crown did and didn't do. And you would agree with me, I take it, that in looking at all of these documents we're going to look at, it's really important to try and understand all the words that are written down in the documents.
Obviously, yes.
And you would agree with me that you just, as Bruce Trigger said, you just can't take the documents at face value in every instance.
I very rarely take any document on its face without reflecting on it and placing it in its context.
Did you hear in my question me accusing you of doing that?
No, I'm just, you're asking me and I'm telling you that's my practice.
Okay. So let's continue on then with tab number 12 of the compendium Exhibit Q, which is a transcription of Trial Exhibit 1-1012 in Phase 1. And that's a letter from Wilson, Indian Commissioner to Pennyfather on September 19, 1857. Now, from the transcription, the date doesn't appear, but that is the date of the trial exhibit. You don't dispute that, or do you know?
I'm sorry, which tab was it?
We're at tab 12.
Well,
In stage 1, trial exhibit 1B 1012.1 is a letter from Wilson to Pennyfather, September 9, 1857. And I'm suggesting to you that this is just a transcription of it. Do you remember seeing this document before?
It looks familiar. It's one that I may have encountered at stage 1.
So the Indian commissioner is writing to Pennyfather, and he notes in the first paragraph at the very end, I suppose the same Indians had also refused to take their annuity this year. This is 1857. And it's about Fort William, right?
Yes.
And so, again, the Fort William Anishinaabe are unhappy with their annuity. We can gather that from the letter, right?
Yes.
And in the second paragraph, Indian Commissioner Wilson writes to Pennyfather and says, I have received another letter from Reverend P. Shoney. So that suggests he received a letter prior to that, right?
Yes.
In which he makes use of very strange language and again demands the pound 10.
Yes.
Now, I haven't seen any follow-up by Pennyfather or anyone else to this document responding to the demands of the pound 10. Have you?
No. I remember discussing this in stage 1 because this was not the first or only time where there was this reference to the 10 pounds, which comes from ultimately from Shingle Council's request for a $10 annuity, which Robinson rejected. But we see it again later on, late in the century. This is repeated.
Yes, my question was, there's no follow-up to this 1857 letter.
Not as far as I'm aware.
Thank you. Let's move then to tab 13. Tab 13 was a document you discussed in your reports. It's a letter from Kearney to Pennyfather of September 3rd, 1858. Trial exhibit in phase 1, 1023. And I've got the transcription at tab 13. And also at tab 13, I've got a second letter that was sent by Kearney to Pennyfather a few days later on September the 6th, 1858, which begins at compendium page 78. But let's start with September 3rd, 1858. You remember that this is the letter in which Kearney explains that the Anishinaabe had asked for $4 within 4 years. And Kearney explains to them, I showed them that this is at page 73.
Yes.
This is, and you've referred to this in your direct testimony. I showed them that they were in error, that the condition was, supposing that these ceded lands were sold and the sum of money realized in the sales was such, after paying expenses of survey and management, that their great father could increase the annuity, that it would be done in proportion to the sum of money realized. So it talks about paying of expenses of survey and management, which might be any sum between what they were receiving and $4, but it was not to exceed $4, that as the ceded lands had not yet been sold, they could not expect any increase in the annuity. And this is where you fixed on, the explanations appeared to satisfy them. There were no such promises made as they had stated. You remember talking about that the other day?
Mr. Schachter, can you tell me where you were reading from?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm at
72,
page
73?
Page 73 of the compendium, tab 13,
Got it.
letter from Kearney to Pennyfather.
Which
It's
paragraph?
in the middle of the page where it's, the pages are separated. It's page 146646,
Thank you.
5, 6, 7. Yeah, and it's that paragraph, and I was reading towards the end of that paragraph.
Thank you. I see it.
Yeah, I apologize. So you talked about that in your direct testimony, I recall?
I wrote about it in my report.
You wrote about it in your report. Okay.
Yes, and I may have alluded to it in my testimony as well.
Right. Now, if you go over on page 75 of the compendium, which is just before the middle of the page where it says PG 146648.
Yes,
Kearney writes further, I will take the liberty of drawing your attention to an important condition of the treaty, by the terms of which the Indians have a reversionary interest in the sales of the ceded lands, depending on the amount of money realized on the sale of the ceded lands. A perpetual annuity of £600 was agreed, and a proviso that if the land sales will permit thereof, the annuity is to be increased to $4 per head. And he continues, keeping that in view, how is it that the Crown Land Department can sell any portion of said land to the pensioners that it is proposed to locate on land adjoining to this reserve at 1 shilling per acre, ? Unless it is intended to make up the difference between the 1 shilling and whatever the upset or average selling price may be. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to suggest to you that what Carney is doing here is fixing upon a solution to the concerns that the Anishinaabe have, that land is being given away and not sold at fair market value.
Yes,
That's what Carney's thinking about. And I think as I see it, Carney is, and maybe you can agree with me on this, Carney is effectively saying to the recipient, look, at the government can make what policy choices they want, but the Anishinaabe should receive the full value of what's being sold. Is that fair? That's why you would have a make up the difference. That's what the make up the difference is about.
yeah, I think what Carney is doing here is, as I said earlier, he seems to have legal background, and he proposes this legal theory that somehow the lands, if they are not sold but given away free,
Or for 1 shilling an acre.
or for a modest sum,
Mhm.
that they somehow have a value that can be translated into a reversionary interest that in of itself can be sold to the government.
Well, no, but I'm sorry, the Indians believe they had a reversionary interest, right?
Well, no, there's
Oh, no, it's
There's
not
no-
the Indians.
no.
It's Carney believes they have a reversionary interest.
yes, there's no way that the Anishinaabe were talking about reversionary interests. This is a legal concept that
Okay,
only Carney imposes upon the interpretation.
okay. We'll see that reversionary interest in 1869 from an Aboriginal petition, but let's wait for that.
The letter starting at page 72, September 3rd, 1858.
Yes, September 3rd, 1858.
Do we know, is that written to Pennyfeather?
Yes, it's from
Penny-
Carney to Pennyfather.
Both of them are. Okay,
Both of them are.
thank you.
But the point I was trying to make is that Carney's whether it's a reversionary interest or not, Carney's proposing that if the government wants to sell the land for less than what it's worth, it would make sense for the government to make up the difference. You see that?
Yes,
And towards the bottom of this page, he says, as a commissioner, I think it's COMR as commissioner.
yes,
As a commissioner, I considered it my duty to bring these points under your consideration as trustees to administer the Indian affairs for their profit and not to suffer any advantage to be taken of them. I'm going to pause there. Is it your view, sir, that Carney has accurately captured the feelings and opinions of the Indian Department towards the Indians in 1858? 1850, yes, 1858.
well, to the extent that he says the government has a duty to administer the Indian affairs and not to suffer any advantage to be taken of them. Yes, but if what he's referring to for their profit, in a general sense, that's true, but as I indicate, I mean, I deal with this on page 152 of my report. This whole thing doesn't makes little sense even today, and I don't know how much sense it made back then.
No,
But
the
it-
little sense you say is about his reversionary interest.
Mr. Marcello, I'm just going to ask you, please don't speak directly to Mr. Schachter.
I'm not speaking, I'm on my feet during the questions addressing your honor.
I missed it then. So if you just wait till I get your attention, I'll deal with it. But
It's an open, I just like to finish.
I'm just going to ask you, I can't manage it that quickly. I got 3 going. So just wait, you stand up, I'll stop everything.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to finish an answer that?
Yes, I talked at great length in my report on page 152 of this notion that there was a duty to sell the lands at the minimum auction or average selling price. There was, of course, such a duty when it came to reserve lands that were surrendered under a specific trust arrangement. But it was not a duty that the government understood to prevail outside of such reserves. And in fact, in the latter case, if we're talking about non-reserve lands, they understood that the Crown had far more discretion, including the right to simply give the lands away free of charge.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Just to be clear then, so your understanding of, from your view, of what the Crown actors believed in after 1850 was that there was no need for them to consider the interests of the Anishinaabe when deciding on what price land would be sold for, given away, because the difference is reserve land as opposed to unsurrendered land. Is that the difference?
The difference is lands that were reserve lands had in the arrangements for their disposal specific conditions involving a trust relationship that included wording to the effect that the lands would be sold to the best advantage of the First Nations who sold those lands. That specific language does not occur in treaties that have annuities. And those.
Let's stick with the Robinson Superior Treaty.
Yeah, so the Robinson Superior Treaty does not contain that same language. And of course, the Crown understood this and all other similar treaties to be the extinguishment of Indian title. And once you extinguish the Indian title, you can do as a Crown anything you pleased. And
That's your understanding of the Crown's obligation in 1850 in respect of the Robinson Superior Treaty then, eh?
I'm telling you by the Crown's actions that that is obviously their understanding, because the fact of the matter is that they passed laws allowing for the disposition of lands without any compensation. And they passed mining regulations from time to time that went so far as to remove the prices or lower the prices for the lands that the mining companies were obliged to pay for in order to conduct their mining. So all of those actions clearly indicate to me that the Crown's understanding was that once Indian title was surrendered, they could, it was not necessarily the case that they had to be sold to the highest or best advantage of the First Nations who had surrendered those lands.
So you're telling me that Mr. Carney's views on the matter are not the views of the government?
That's correct.
All right, so he's an outlier then, eh?
Yeah, we don't really even, as I said earlier, we don't even know what his biography is. But he is, what he's doing is he's clearly trying to find a solution. I'm not sure he completely understands the treaty the way the Crown, other Crown officials do. And he comes up with a legal analysis that otherwise doesn't make sense either, because as I also pointed out in my report, this so-called reversionary interest, if it existed, would logically apply to all the ceded lands, including those sold at higher prices or the upset or average selling price, and not just those sold for 1 shilling.
Yes,
So that in and of itself,
all right.
you know, makes the whole scenario puzzling and suggests to me that you didn't fully understand what was going on here.
Well, I'm going to suggest to you and put it to you that he understood what was going on here and was bringing it to the attention of Pennyfather that the Indians weren't being fairly dealt with. Do you agree?
I agree that he was trying to communicate that the Anishinaabe were not being fairly dealt with. What I disagree with is that his understanding of why they were not being fairly dealt with would not have been taken seriously by the Crown.
That's true. It wasn't taken seriously. Whether it should have or not is something else. I agree with that. But can we at least agree that there was no follow-up to this concern about administering the Indian affairs for their profit and not to suffer any advantage to be taken of them and making up the difference? That wasn't followed up, was it?
Yes, that's right.
All right. Now let's go to the September 6th, 1858 letter. We're 3 days later, and Mr. Carney's writing a second letter to Carney. And this is, again, still at tab 13. It's a transcription of trial exhibit 1-1024 in phase 1 at page 78 of the compendium. And remember the exchange where Carney on September the 3rd says that he has assuaged their concerns, and here I'm paraphrasing. Do you remember that?
They seem to be satisfied.
They seem to be satisfied.
Yes.
Let's take a look at what he writes 3 days later. Second paragraph. Sorry, first paragraph, he says, "Sir, in my letter of the 3rd instant," that's the one we just went through,
Yes.
"there was an intimation that there was something I ought to bring under your notice of what transpired at Garden River." So he's telling him here, there's more to the story. And then he says in the next paragraph, "It appeared to me there was a feeling of discontent on account of promises which had been made them, none of which had been fulfilled, comma. In my explanation, I stated that I had transacted much business between the Indians, their great father, and the Indian Department, that from my experience, I was certain that their great father was desirous that all treaty stipulations should be faithfully discharged and every promise fulfilled, and that the department was anxious to administer their responsible trust with fidelity and for the advantage of the Indians." So he's telling Pennyfather that this is what he told the Indians. You see that?
Yes.
I have never seen a letter from Pennyfather saying, "Why did you tell them that?" or that you were wrong to tell them that. Have you seen a letter like that? You're shaking your head
No, I have not.
Okay. And do you have any explanation as to why Carney didn't just include these words or these paragraphs in his first letter? Why he's writing twice?
Well, much of the first letter was really about the incident of the horse being shot and so whatever else was there was more of an aside. Whereas here he starts his letter with kind of a follow-up to his earlier thoughts on the subject.
It sounds to me that on September 6th, 1858, Kearney's not quite convinced that the Anishinaabe were so assuaged by his assurances. Would you agree with that?
No, I can't go that far to.
Okay, well, let's wait for it. We'll get to it in the latter part of the letter. Over at page 80 of the compendium, still part of this letter, at the bottom of the page, for some reason, Kearney writes in writing to Pennyfather, tells Pennyfather this: I have found it the best policy in dealing with the Indians to avoid any and every appearance of trickery, comma, to be candid, comma, to act truthfully, comma, openly and honestly with them. I'm going to stop there. In your reading of the documents in this history, is Kearney trying to suggest that other people have not been dealing with the Indians, have been dealing with the Indians with trickery, untruthfully, unopenly, dishonestly? Sounds like he's saying, I, Kearney, do not do these things, suggesting that other people do.
Yeah, I think this is in the context of not that Kearney himself has encountered non-Indigenous government officials engaged in such trickery or not being candid, but rather that the Anishinaabe, who as Kearney said in his letters, have not been apprised of the way the accounting works when it comes to the distribution of their annuity payments. I'm talking here about the pre-augmented annuities. The Anishinaabe have throughout this early period expressed the view that they were somehow being tricked because the annuity payments were so small. They were even smaller than expected to begin with, but they were also decreasing rather than increasing. They were also not being paid at the times they wanted them to be paid. And so there was discontent about that issue. And that created feelings that perhaps the government had or was continuing to trick them somehow. And I think it's in that context that Kearney's writing.
Kearney then continues, they will be suspicious of anyone who attempts any intriguing with them. And there's a word missing in suspicions by nature, as well as the treatment they have received at the hands of white men.
Yes.
So it sounds like he's noting that they've received some bad treatment at the hands of white men. Yeah.
Yes, they've had problems with trespassing on reservations, and they've also had problems with people stealing timber and off their lands and that sort of thing. So they've had no shortage of altercations with non-Indigenous peoples around them.
So we're looking at 1858 now, and it looks like they're having some problems. And Kearney continues, and their confidence is forfeited. Any endeavored with the Indians at Garden River was to, and the word is unclear, but it might be assuage their prejudices, again in square brackets because it's not exactly clear. But what is clear from the text is often and to restore confidence, and I entertain much. Before that it was not entirely successful. Much will depend on the department to complete restoration of confidence.
Yes,
So I'm suggesting to you that Carney in this second letter is communicating, I'm not really quite sure that my attempt to assuage them, as I said in the letter of third, was that successful, and much will depend on the department to complete a restoration of confidence. See that?
yes.
Would you agree that that's a fair reading of that letter?
I think in the second instance, he's talking in more general terms about the nature of the discontent. It's not so much that this specific the specific thing that they have been complaining about, which he documents in the first letter, is not necessarily linked to these more general observations as a whole. And I think because there's a lot more being complained about than simply the fact that they haven't received their full $4 yet, which they had expected within 4 years. There's a lot more to it. And so
All right, so
Can I-
let's
can I
move on.
just- Sorry, can I
Yeah.
just see if I understand? There's a lot more to it than just they haven't received their full $4. Okay. Go ahead.
yes,
Thank you.
Remember when we were looking at the September 3rd letter, we went through a section that said about where Carney said, talked about sales after paying expenses of survey and management. It's at page 73. We read it, but because I want to go back to that, because in the second letter, Carney returns to the issue of surveys. I just want to remind you that first, Carney identifies in September 3rd that the expenses of survey and management should be paid, right? Or should be deducted before figuring out what's owing, or figuring out whether there was an increase in the annuity that could be done.
yes, he says, after paying expenses of survey and management,
Okay,
that's when the increase in annuity would be done in
Okay.
proportion to the sum of money realized.
at page 82, he returns to the issue of surveys in the middle of the page. And he says, this is at page 82 of the compendium. And I acknowledge that this is in respect of reserves, not in respect of just land that was surrendered generally. So I understand that. But his point is, but I can scarcely think that such to be the fact, for what benefit can it be to the Indians to sell a location if the purchase money is to be expended in marking out its boundaries? Be as well, if not better, to keep it with any present information. It is not my opinion. It is, in my opinion, preposterous to suppose that they should seize a valuable location for which a certain price was to be paid, then instead of which they are told, there is no money coming to you. It has all be expended in surveying all the locations, close quotation marks. If that is really so, it is no wonder they are discontented and complain. with white men who can comprehend business transactions, it may do, but with the Indian it will not do to treat them so. But no white man would sell a valuable property with the understanding that the purchase money was to be expended in surveying it off from his other property. You see that?
Yes,
And so Carney, and I appreciate it's in the context of reserve land. Carney is concerned and saying we shouldn't be deducting the cost of surveys from the lands that the money, the proceeds they're entitled to, right?
yeah, it's more specific than that, because when they refer to locations, they're talking about the mining locations. And as you recall in my report and my earlier testimony, the license fee of £150 was intended to be two things. First, it was intended to be the it was intended to defray the cost of surveying the location. Secondly, it was intended also as the first down payment on the location. And you may recall that in my testimony, during these early years in the 1850s, the government was only getting these license fees and they were surveying locations, but they really weren't making any more money on it. So that's what's going on here. It's an artifact of the mining regulations, which go back to 1846.
Would you agree with me, sir, that Carney is registering a concern that the Anishinaabe are not being fairly dealt with?
Yes, in his view, they are not being fairly dealt with.
At page 83 of the letter, at the top, Carney actually recommends the advisability of yearly accounts to be rendered.
Yes.
That wasn't followed up on, was it?
No, I pointed this out in my report. It was one of the inactions that I chronicled at the end of my report. And
Thank
it
you.
was not, as far as I know, I found no official record until the 1870s when such accounting was actually communicated directly to, I should say, it was communicated to the Indian agents that they provide this information to the First Nations.
Now, what's happening in 1858 is further exacerbated, I would suggest, by what happens in the very next paragraph at 83, page 83 of the compendium. Because Carney goes on to explain that they find fault also with being charged the expenses of the agent among to pay them. They say the treaty provides as it does that the chiefs and the tribes were to be paid 600, and there's a dollar sign there, but we know it should be pounds because this is in the RHT.
Yes,
Each year, anything less than that amount is an infringement of the treaty. And so the Indians are complaining that being deducted from their annuity are costs of paying them the annuity.
yeah, as far as I know, that's not true.
You don't think it's true?
As far as I know, you keep in mind that it's the Hudson's Bay Company is not charging anything for the distribution of these annuities.
Okay, so it's not true at RST, but it's true at RHT. Is that what you mean?
It may be true in RHT. There was, there may have been charges. Yes, I suppose you're right. I mean, we keep talking about this as if everything is RST, but in this case, it's not. Right? Because Garden River is not actually RST.
That's right.
So you're right. There may have been some expenses involved in the distribution of the funds. I don't recall what those were. It may have been the cost of transport.
Okay.
But the agents were agents of the Crown who had salaries. They're not.
Yeah, they shouldn't be taking money.
No.
I agree with that, but but the record will show whether they did or not. We don't need to debate it here.
Okay.
So let's go on to the next document. Now we're going to go to 1865. We've gone from 1858. We're going to 1865. This is reports of the inspectors of free ports of Gaspé and Sault Ste. Marie. I asked you yesterday if you had received this from the government lawyers or from the Crown, and you said no. And if you go over to, this is excerpts from a trial exhibit 17, I believe. And in it, there is some interesting information about what two chiefs from, again, they're Huron chiefs admittedly, but I want to go through it and then see if there was any follow-up, okay? First question, when did you get this document? You've seen it before.
Yes, so the first time that I actually saw this, I should say the first time that I was made aware of this document without having seen it was when I read Dr. Bohocker's reply report, which was a few months ago.
Right.
I did not recall any experts having referred to this document in stage one. I may
Right.
be wrong, but
Okay.
I don't recall anyone having referred to this. I did not refer to it. I was not aware of it. So the first time that I actually was made aware of it was in relation to Dr. Bohocker's report. And
We
of
don't have to
course-
worry about what Dr. Bohocker said about it. I'm interested about your opinion about it.
Well, I have the disadvantage of having written a response, which is not in the record because Dr. Bohocker is no longer testifying.
Okay, well,
So
let's see
I'll-
how you do.
Okay, I'll go from memory. So my,
Well, I haven't asked you a question about it
oh,
yet.
okay. Sorry, go
Like-
ahead.
Yeah, all right. So the first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to situate this and what it's about. If you look at page 93, at the bottom, sorry, 1/3 of the way from the top, there's a discussion about what's happening in Garden River.
Yes,
And the second last paragraph reads, my last visit to Garden River was with Mr. Wilson, who was sent down there by the Indian Department in order to get the consent of the Indians to the surrender of 2 copper locations on the reserve of $400 each. I'm going to stop there for a moment.
400 acres each.
Oh, sorry. Yes. 400 acres each, my apologies. I'm going to stop there for a moment. Mr. Wilson is the Indian agent, or do you know who he is?
Yeah, he is an agent of the department. But he went to Garden River specifically for this purpose.
Right, and it says to get the consent of the Indians. That's an odd phraseology. Not to offer them the opportunity, but to get it, as though he's on a mission to get them to consent. Is that what was happening? Do you know?
I think that it's probably a synonym for obtain.
Okay, that's the way you read it. Okay, I note that the person who's applied for it is a fellow by the name of Mr. Keating.
Yes,
Was Mr. Keating the same Mr. Keating that interpreted the treaty?
he was one of the interpreters, but he was also, he had been involved in advising mining interests long before the treaty, and had some interests in them after the treaty as well.
Okay. So the author of this report goes on to identify the following. The council assembled in due Indian form on the bank of Garden River, and Mr. Wilson, through an interpreter, explained to them the object of his visit and what he asked for, when, after a good deal of consultation and gesticulating, the senior chief present, Pequachinini, made a speech and declined to surrender the two locations, thus, for a time, at all events, retarding the progress of that part of the district. So it sounds like Indians not surrendering is a bad thing from the government view. It's retarding the progress. Would you agree that that's the intent that you can glean from that phraseology?
Yeah, I think as in general, you know, to promote any kind of development, they would have regarded impediments such as indigenous claims as,
This isn't a claim, it's a reserve.
yes, but from their point of view, it happens that there was a mining location or a potential mine on it.
And the interpreter from the treaty wanted it. Mr. Keating.
Yes, they wanted to open mines and work them.
It does sound to me to be fair in context that the officials of the government are looking upon the Indians in 1865 as a nuisance people who retard the progress of white civilization. Is that fair?
I think I mean, normally I wouldn't agree to such generalizations, but I think in the 19th century context, that's probably a fair comment than
Thank you.
in any otother context.
Yeah, thank you.
Just let me catch up for a moment, please.
Now, these two, oh, sorry. Yes, let you catch up.
Thank you. Thank you.
These two chiefs, Pequachinini and Nebenegoching. One of them for sure rings a bell, Nebenegoching. But if you look at the treaty, both Pequachinini and Nebenegoching, they were actually there in 1850, remember?
Yes,
Those are two firsthand witnesses to what happened at the treaty councils of 1850.
yes,
And they don't want to surrender their reserve, and they requested the interpreter to say to me that, and I'm reading from the document at page 93 of the compendium at the bottom. They requested the interpreter to say to me that they wish to communicate the contents of the former speech to the government. I promised I would, and the speech, almost word for word, will be found in the appendix. And I'm only going to deal with, I'm going over to the appendix. And here's the speech of Chief Pequachinini, witness to the 1850 treaty. He says, "You will tell the Governor General from us that we are poor, very poor, obliged to go out and catch a fish for our meal, that many of us are old and not able to work, semicolon, that many years ago, in brackets, 1850, close brackets. Mr. Robinson was sent up to us by the governor, semicolon. We made a treaty with him, comma, and surrendered a large portion of our lands, period. Mr. Robinson promised us that the land should be surveyed and sold, comma, and at the end of 1 year, we and each member of our people should receive $4 in cash, comma, and that the rest of the money should be invested at interest for our benefit. You see that?
Yes.
Now, I looked through all the documents I could find. I have never seen a response to this petition. Have you?
No, as I said, one of the reasons why this particular appendix has remained in relative obscurity is because it was published in a rather esoteric context, and which is why, most of us have never seen it before.
I'm not finding fault with the researchers for not finding it, but that's not an excuse for the people in 1865 not to deal with it.
Well, actually, it is related, because if we, with all of our scanning and computer technology today, had a hard time finding it, it's not at all it's not incomprehensible to me that this continued to lie in obscurity. What was obviously responded to were petitions that went through Dawson, who actually sent them directly to the Secretary of State and to the Lieutenant Governor. Whereas this, I don't know where it ended up, because we have no, we have neither letters that precede it or come after it. But my response to Dr. Bohacker on this was more to the point, and that is.
Are you reading from something?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember exactly what I said, but
I mean, you're free to go look at your report from a response to Dr. Bohacker if you want to.
well, I
refresh
wasn't,
your memory.
No, I wasn't expecting to testify anything in respect to Dr. Bohacker, but what I must say is that right from the beginning, if we compare that paragraph to the one at tab 13, which we just went through at page 73, here, the same community about 6-7 years earlier,
Yeah.
according to Carney, were under the impression that they were to receive $600 per annum for 4 years, and after that, $4 per head.
This is
so-
Mr. Carney's recollection, not Pequiccinini's recollection.
Yes, but if
Are you suggesting, sir, that we should prefer Mr. Carney's recollection of a conversation he had in 1858, in which we're not even sure that he fully assuaged the Anishinaabe, over the words as recorded by Pequiccinini and Nebadinagoching, who were there in 1850?
Well, Mr. Carney would not have tried to disabuse them of this if he didn't have, if he didn't hear correctly, right? What
Well, we
he
don't know
heard,
that.
what he heard them say, or what he said, they had another impression that they were to receive $600 per annum for 4 years, and after that, $4 per head. Now, when I look at this, my response to Dr. Bohacker was, here we have, an earlier understanding and a later understanding, and they are at best equivocal, and at worst, both or one is garbled. But I know, I have, had a considerably long career in trying to understand change and continuity in oral history evidence. And this reminds me very much of the Victor Buffalo case that I dealt with, where it's a very similar situation where within a few years, there is a record of an oral understanding of what happened at the time of treaty. In the Victor Buffalo case, it was treaty number 6. And there are these changes that occur through time. And I'm not suggesting that this material has to be dismissed, but I am suggesting that we really need to take this with a grain of salt. I mean, it's this document, once I read it in Dr. Bohocker's report, it caused me to rethink how much reliance I should place on the Carney evidence and other petitions that came later that Anishinaabe people sent.
Which seem to suggest, so you mean the ones that you say suggest that the Anishinaabe understood that they were only entitled to $4 capped? We should be cautious about putting stock in those. Is that what you mean?
I'm suggesting we need to be cautious about all of these. In some cases, there may be the feedback effect, which I talked about in stage 1. That seems to be the case with one petition or one recollection that occurred, I think, in the 1890s, where somebody said, well, yeah, after after 4 years, we get the full amount. And where that 4 years comes from, I don't know whether that's an independent recollection or whether it is feedback from other sources. I can't say.
Will you at least concede this, sir, that Pequichinini and Nebenegoching's 1865 speech is consistent with the phase 1 decision that there is no cap on the collective entitlement, and that individually members were entitled to $4?
Yeah, I'm not sure what is meant by the rest of the money.
Well, if each individual member gets $4 and there is something called the rest of the money, that suggests to me that there's more than $4 payable. Would you agree?
Yes.
Right. Now, we don't have to debate what the interpretation of the treaty is, because that's already been done in phase 1. The point is, the petition wasn't followed up on. That's the only point.
Well,
For
it's not
today.
really first of all, it's not really a petition.
I'm sorry, it's a speech that they wanted communicated to the government. You agree with that, right?
Yes, it's a record of a speech explaining why they were reluctant to part with the mining location lands.
Over at page 93, they said they wished to communicate the contents of the
Yes.
former speech to the government.
Yes,
And I promised that I would.
yes.
And there's no follow-up to what I consider to be a pretty important document and position of people who are actually present. So the only importance, I think, for phase 3 is that this is an example of the Crown making a conscious decision not to follow up. Isn't that what you can get from this document? And the absence of
No.
any response?
No, because that would imply that they received this and read it and consciously decided not to. I have no evidence of that. We have literally no paper trail accompanying this, so I don't know what happened to it. I think Anderson, C.E. Anderson, obviously followed through. with the request to have this communicated. But what happened to it after that, perhaps more research would illuminate that.
Well, we've had about 23 years to do research.
Yes.
Nothing's come up yet. Correct?
That's right, except that we also had 20 years of research and then this came up.
Well, it may have come up earlier than 20 years. We don't know exactly when it came up. So let's move on then. Tab 15 is the 1869 Garden River petition. And here it's at page 95 of the compendium. You've seen this transcription before, yes? We're at tab 15.
Yes, I'm assuming that this is the same one that I talk about at length, starting at page 193 of my report.
I believe it is.
Although I tend to rely on the original archival versions rather than transcriptions.
All right, would you like to go then? You can find the archival one at tab 16.
Well, it's going to be a lot more difficult to read, so
Well, that's why I put, that's why I
Yes.
had the transcribed version.
No, that's fair enough. To be clear, I actually transcribe it myself at pages 193 to 194 of my report. So if there's any discrepancy, it's easily detectable.
All right, so why don't we use your page? I'm gonna compare the two. We'll use your page 193 because I want to look at the third complaint. Would you agree with me the third complaint is a complaint about land being given away?
Yes,
And would you agree to me that the solution of the Anishinaabe is maybe we should sell what they consider to be their reversionary interest and would execute a deed of surrender upon receiving reasonable compensation? See that?
yes.
They seem to think that, and where do you think they got the term reversionary interest? Do you think that they're lawyers or not? Do you have any help there?
Well, that's a very good question. I do not know what assistance they had. What I do know is that the interpreters who prepared this included William Wawanash and William Fisher,
Yes.
and William Wawanash worked as an interpreter and a teacher under salary from the Indian Department, and he was actually a chief of what's now referred to as the Chippewas of Sarnia. So he's actually an outsider. And William Fisher, who was also an interpreter, was under salary as an interpreter and counselor of the Chippewas of Walpole Island, which is also near Sarnia. I'm not sure what the connection was between these two gentlemen and the petitioners. So there was definitely more than just the individuals who are mentioned or who have their X's affixed to this. I don't know how it was influenced or who came up with their
Okay, so-
reversionary interest.
So we don't know and we don't want to speculate. So
No.
let's just put it aside. You would agree with me that a fair reading of this petition is that the Anishinaabe are trying to make the best out of what they consider to be a bad situation. They want to just forget about the augmentation promise and have a full and final surrender at a reasonable price. Isn't that what they're trying to communicate?
Yeah, what I found remarkable about this is that rather than pressing for an annuity augmentation that was drawn from the proceeds of the lands, they're intimating that the undertaking could not be fulfilled in the first place. And because of, among other things, by this time there was an act that has passed in Parliament to an act to secure free grants and homesteads, which allowed governments to give away lands for free. And that, of course, for the Anishinaabe, would have meant that it precluded extracting revenues from the lands.
So you can understand why they'd feel like the government had broken faith with them.
Yeah, so, and under that circumstance, this unfulfilled promise amounted to some kind of reversionary interest.
Right.
But the
And-
obvious flaw in the argument was that there were in fact proceeds other than those derived from the sale of land.
But-
So it's not as if, you know, I mean, first of all, not all lands were given away for free.
No,
It's a small
we
number.
don't say that they did,
Yes,
but Dr. Von Gernert, the only point I'm trying to establish here, which I think you've already agreed to, is that these Anishinaabe in 1869 are seeing lands being given away and are in effect saying to the government, whatever our rights were to get increased annuities, we're willing to sell that to you for more consideration.
yes,
Yes. And the fourth thing that they say in the bullet is that under the Treaty of Secession, the right of fishing was reserved, and which is now reserved by your memorialists, and which is now withheld. They're complaining that they can't hunt and fish.
yes,
And then the very last request prior to their signatures or their X's is to say, "Great Chief, always unhesitantly loyal to your excellency, your memorialists venture to claim your favorable consideration in this their expectation, and as your memorialists in duty bound we ever pray." They're requesting a response from the Governor General, right?
yes.
We know that no response ever came, right? We're going to go through Plummer's response.
Yes, because I, in my report, I do deal with the aftermath of this.
Well, let's deal with the aftermath. Now, that's at tab 16. Now, at tab 16, you made the point of saying this petition together with another one was picked up by a fellow by the name of Plummer, and he sent it to to Joseph Howe, right?
Yes, because of where this came from, it ended up on the desk of the visiting superintendent, William Plummer, who was then at the Indian office in Manitowaning, which is on Manitoulin Island. So
All
that's where they ended up. And then from there, Plummer forwarded these memorials to Joseph Howe, who was at the time the Dominion of Canada's Secretary of State for the provinces. And as such, he was also the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs.
All right, but we're going to get to the two petitions that were included in a moment. But if you look at page 98 of the compendium, you will see that prior to Plummer's very neatly written letter to Mr. Howe, there is on the front page on a date that is 17 something 1871, that's Joseph Howe's initials. We're gonna pull it up on the
I see
screen.
17th of July, 1871.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, this is sort of the papers that precede the file.
I'm gonna read you what it says there because it's we don't have a transcription, but I'm gonna read it to you. And I think you and I together, because we're familiar with these historic documents, can probably agree on what it says. The first word, can you make it out? Because that's when I can't. It says something, and let's leave that alone for a moment. What I can make out is of the within petition should be forwarded to the Provincial Secretary of Ontario with the request that he will lay them before the Lieutenant Governor in order, and then I can't read the next word, of the Indians to an increased compensation for the lands ceded in 1850 to which the treaty entered into with them, that you guaranteed under certain conditions receiving careful consideration.
Yeah, that's more or less the gist of it.
Right, so what it is, it's Mr. Howe suggesting that this should be forwarded to Ontario for Ontario to respond. Now, you had suggested that the date on that at the bottom was July 1871. I'm going to suggest to you that it is February
Yes.
17, 1871. Would you
Yes,
agree?
Yes. Actually, that's more in accord with my own interpretation on page 198 of my report.
Thank you, sir. Now, if you will look at page 108 of the compendium, you will actually see Ontario's response. It's dated February 23rd, 1871, a few days after Howe asks. Yes, okay. So we're looking at the compendium, page 108,
Got it.
last page of the tab. We have Ontario's response. Remember, Howe is suggesting it should go to the province.
Yes.
And here we have the following from a fellow by the name of Thos C. Patterson, Assistant Secretary, to the Honorable the Secretary of State, Indian Branch Provinces of Ottawa. So this is their response on February 23rd, 1871. Sir, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your letter of 18th instant addressed to the Provincial Secretary, enclosing two memorials from the Indians of the North Shore of Lake Huron and the Great Manitoulin Island, praying for increased compensation for lands ceded by them in 1850.
Yes.
I am directed to inform you that the matter will be submitted to His Excellency's consideration through the Commissioner of Crown Lands for this province. See that?
Yes.
And I think, to be fair to you, I think you said there was no follow-up to this at all.
Yes. So on page 198, when I deal with all of this material, I say, quote, steps were clearly taken to deal with the matter, although the details of what happened next are not preserved in the record. Well-documented efforts by the government to address Anishinaabe claims relating to annuity augmentations are not found until 1873, when a petition by the RST Fort William Band resulted in prompt action.
That's just not the case, sir. There is no evidence that anything was done with this petition after Mr. Patterson's letter. There's nothing in the record. It's not that something was done that we don't have a record of. We don't have a record of anything being done.
There's nothing that I found preserved in the record. It's correct.
But there's not even a suggestion in the record that anything was done. When the 18th, do you agree with that?
Well, if nothing is preserved in the record, then we literally don't know one way or the other.
Well,
I think it's
but that's not what you said. In your report, you say something was done, but we don't have a record of it. That's not fair.
No, I said steps were clearly taken to deal with the matter.
Stop
and
right there.
Yes.
What steps were clearly taken to deal with the matter?
Up to footnote 407. Everything we've done so far up to the events of February 23rd. When I'm talking about, when I say steps were clearly taken to deal with the matter, I'm including everything that we've covered so far, up to including February 23rd, 1871.
But February 23rd, 1871 is just a notice saying we're going to deal with it. Not that they have dealt with it.
No, it has gone through a chain of transmission. That's dealing with the matter in part. It's not concluding it, obviously. I agree with you perfectly well that we have no record of anything beyond that. In other words, it's not a question of this having not been dealt with at all. Something was done.
What was
Could I-
done, sir?
Sorry, it may be that Mr. Schachter's already asked this question, but you said something was done and you referred earlier to it was transmitted up the chain. Is that what you mean by something was done? Or I'll ask, or.
All right, so
answer
what,
Mr. Schachter's
to be
question.
clear, what was done is that the two Anishinaabe memorials of June 12th, 1869 and July 25th, 1870 went to the Indian office in Manitowoc, where the visiting superintendent, William Plummer, received them. He then communicated these by letter to Plummer, Plummer
Howe.
forwarded them to Joseph Howe, who was
Yes.
the Dominion of Canada Secretary of State for Provinces, and hence also the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. So he's the top civil servant in the Indian Affairs Department. And then the next step, Howe forwarded those to the Ontario Provincial Secretary on February 18th. And then on February 23rd, Thomas Pattison, who's the Assistant Secretary in the Ontario Provincial Secretary's office, acknowledged receipt. And his superior had directed Pattison to inform that the matter will be submitted to His Excellency's consideration to the Commissioner of Crown Lands for this province. Those are the steps that were clearly taken to deal with the matter. What happened after that, I have no knowledge of, because there's nothing preserved in the record that relates to this.
Sir, you have no evidence that anything was submitted to for His Excellency's consideration, do you? You have a letter saying it would be done, but
Yes.
you don't have anything, and no, there's no evidence it was done.
That's correct.
And when Howe got this response, because he's the Secretary of State, I see nothing in the record that I've been able to find where Howe followed it up.
Yes, I have not seen anything in the record either, which is why I made the comment. And I included this in part of my list of inactions.
I think now would be a good time for a break.
Okay, thank you. 15?
Yep.
Let's go recess for 15 minutes. So now resume, you may be seated.
We Begin.
Are we good?
It seems like we're good. Okay, Dr. Von Gernert, I want to sort of square the circle and end our discussion about the plumber how correspondence by going to the second petition from the people from the Great Manitoulin Island. And I think if you look to compendium page 105, you will find that document. And at the top, we're looking at the top of page 105. This is a petition that is signed with X's by a lot of people at Little Current in July of 1870. You talked about this in your report, yes?
Yes, page 196.
Yes, and at the top, you can see that it's to His Excellency, the Right Honorable Sir John Young.
Yes,
And in the second line, you can tell, you see it's from Great Manitoulin Island
yes,
in the second paragraph, second line. Yes, and then if we go down, I wanted to highlight what these Anishinaabe were complaining about.
but just before you go on, I
Yeah.
just wanted to clarify that it's not really a petition from Manitoulin Island. It is a petition that resulted from a grand council at Little Current on Manitoulin Island. But it, as you correctly point out, it's signed by numerous chiefs.
Yes. All right, so if you go down to towards the bottom of the page, what they're asking for,
Yes,
and they say, and we've got it highlighted on the computer screen in front of us, and this was the best way that I could direct people's attention to it. We would therefore humbly ask and entreat your excellency to have the said sacred friendship renewed, as we do in our part, by respecting our rights to the lands. See that?
yes,
So they're asking for renewal. And we've heard about that concept of renewal in phase one. You remember that?
yes,
And the second thing that they ask for, and we're going down towards the bottom of this page, your excellent, and it's highlighted in yellow on the computer screen in front of you. Your excellency ought therefore to endeavor to get the right thing done for us like a good father does. So there's our invoking a kinship metaphor. Would you
Yes.
agree?
yes,
And then the bottom of the page, they say, we sometimes think that the said sacred friendship is not held as sacred as when first made. Yes, you see that?
yes, I see it.
So they're complaining that they want renewal, that the friendship isn't being made, and then they go on to, on the next page, talk about some grievances. And the first grievances is at the first bullet, or the first, it says first, and I'm just going to paraphrase it. They're complaining that the Indian Department is trying to get them to sell their reserves. Do you see that?
Yes,
That doesn't sound right, does it? It sounds like they're treating the Anishinaabe as a nuisance towards progress.
yes, they're complaining that they got pressure to surrender reserves.
And then in the second bullet, they're complaining that the Game and Fish Acts are making them liable to suffer punishment. You see that?
Yes,
And then the third item, they complaining they can't even make use of the resources from their own reserve lands. That's another complaint.
yes,
And then at the bottom of this page, they seek from the Governor General that the injustice be corrected. Right? They ask that to correct the injustice
yes,
and evils which we have complained of.
yes.
And so that's one of the petitions together with the 1869 petition that end up going nowhere as far as we know, right?
They go as far as the chain as I've identified, and then I have lost track of them because there's no record.
Okay. So that's 1871, and we're going to skip over 1873 to 1875. We're going to come back to that. And if you go over to tab 17, you'll see the chief of Spanish River in 1883 talks about his friend Solomon James at the bottom.
Yes,
And the first part of this document is just, you should put an X through it. It's only the bottom 5 lines
yes,
that are a transcript of the chief of Spanish River.
Yes.
What would you call this, a letter or a petition?
Yeah, it's a letter.
All right. And this chief of Spanish River is talking about his friend Solomon James, who's going to come up soon again. And in this is the one, the other instance where someone's asking for $10 per head.
Yes, I talked about this one at some length in my second report in stage 1.
Right. The only point is, for now, is here's another complaint of demands for more than $4, which are ignored. Correct?
Yes, in this case, the memory is that the actual amount was $10 instead of $4. And I remember discussing this in my second report of stage 1, but I don't remember if there was any aftermath to this.
All right. The next document at tab 18 is a letter from Skeen to the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs on January 9th, 1884. And I've just got a transcription that was done up for phase 1. And this is Skeen explaining of a meeting that he had. And if you go over on page 112 of the compendium, you'll see a list of complaints.
Yes,
Now, the first complaint at the top of page 1 deals with the right to hunt and fish, and they're not being allowed to do so. The second is that they want arrears, and the third one is they want an advance on the $4. See that?
yes,
And at the bottom of the page, it says, with regard to the 3 question, I at first said that by the Robinson Treaty, $4 was the utmost sum to be given as annuity. The answer was that it is not so. And upon this, I again referred to the written copy of the treaty, sent to me by the department, in which I found, provided the amount paid to each individual shall not exceed the sum of £1 provincial currency in any 1 year, or such further sum as Her Majesty may be graciously pleased to orders. The Indians therefore think by this time enough has been paid to the Crown lands from lands ceded by them to entitle them to an advance. These, as I understood, are the matters which they wish to bring to the notice of the Superintendent General. Now, you will agree with me, sir, that in respect of the request for the increased annuity, there is no response to this request.
Yeah, I don't recall if there was any follow-up to this, but the notion that it was $10 a head was understood by the same person who's writing this as being nonsense.
Well, let's take a look at what he says. It's at the bottom of page 113 of the compendium. I would also mention that Chief James showed me a letter, which illegible, one of the chiefs of the North Shore had sent to him, asking him to deliver it to the Superintendent General at Ottawa. Various matters are spoken of in this letter, and amongst others that Mr. Robinson, at the making of the treaty, told the chief that the annuity would be $10 per head as soon as the land were surveyed. I told James that this was all nonsense. And this is what you've just identified.
Yes.
To look at the treaty, but this is the part you didn't mention. But he said the chief had been told so. In short, he seemed to insinuate that the interpreter had played false and apparently remained of that opinion. And then he says, but I have frequently had representations of this nature made to me, and as often found them to be without foundation. So what we have here is an acknowledgement that it isn't just this one outlier who's asking for more than $4. It's a frequent representation asking for more than $4. Now, I understand that this good soul might honestly believe that there was a $4 cap. Maybe he had been told by Mr. Blake that there was a $4 cap. Who knows? The fact of the matter was, we have Anishinaabe frequently representing that more than $4 is their entitlement. Would you agree with that? That's the only way to understand this in the context, right?
Well, in this case, it's more specific than that. It's that the deal was that it was $10 per head. It was a fixed annuity that was not $4, but rather $10. And I think I testified at some length in stage one about this very matter, that if this was in fact their understanding, if this was in fact their understanding at the time, then we have to reconcile that with the earlier evidence that they thought it was $4, and also, other understandings that it, it was $4 after 4 years or $4 after 1 year.
And we'd have to figure out and reconcile whether the $4 is for individuals and the balance would go to collectives. I mean, there's lots of permutations, but the point is the Anishinaabe are asking for more than $4 and they're being ignored.
Yes, because I think, there's no question that the Crown officials, if they had seen this, and I can't confirm one way or the other whether this actually was attended to it was sent to, but I don't know if it was attended to. It may have just have been dismissed offhand. It should really have had a response.
Yes,
I-
it should have.
I have no, at least with an explanation of why it was considered to be nonsense, as Skeen puts it. At the very least, it should have had a response. I agree with you. But I can understand why it may have been dismissed. I do not understand why it did not elicit a formal response and explanation to the Anishinaabe, why it was not going to be $10.
But Dr. Van Gurnett, even under the most illiberal interpretation where anything over $4 is at the discretion of Her Majesty, we know that Her Majesty intends to deal honorably, liberally, and generously back from 1850. Even with the most illiberal interpretation, the Crown would have to turn its mind to whether it wanted or should increase it beyond $4. But that never happened.
Well, there was some musings by Vancouver, but it was not, ultimately they left it at $4. And part of the reason is that by now you've got 7 numbered treaties that have $5 annuities. And so, yes, it may have been consistent with the Crown's honor to, invoke the graciousness clause to increase it to $5. But there's no way that they're going to risk. I'm talking here, trying to think within the minds of these officials in the 19th century. They are not going to risk an amount that is so much beyond the original $4 that it would give rise to numerous complaints by First Nations who otherwise got $5 annuities. And I think part of that is the thinking. In fact, I can demonstrate that that was the thinking because I refer to in one of my reports to Treaty Number 9, where this very issue came up, because at first Treaty 9 was supposed to be an adhesion to the Robinson treaties, in which case they would get $4. And indeed, at the end of the day, Treaty 9 did provide $4. But there was a lot of departmental discussion about whether, should we even contemplate, deviating from these numbers.
What year was that? Treaty 9?
Treaty 9 was in 1905, but it's the lead up to it was at least 5 years earlier.
So about 1900, about 50 years after the Robinson Superior Treaty was made.
That's right.
Would you agree with me that times had changed between 1850 and 1900?
Times have certainly changed, but they are still, believe it or not, they were contemplating simply having an adhesion to the Robinson Treaty. That was their first plan. Was
I'm
to,
going to
was to
suggest
have the chiefs in the Treaty 9 area simply adhere, because there was by then an adhesion process that was used in a number of treaties. So they thought, why not just have them sign on to the Robinson treaties on the same terms? But they ended up deciding that they would use the numbered treaty model, but instead of giving $5, they gave $4. And Treaty 9 is an exception in that regard. So they're thinking about parity and payments. They're thinking about all kinds of factors. It's not just, the honor of the Crown requires you to, maximize the annuities.
where's the evidence, sir, with all your comments about parity of raising the $4 to $5? Where's that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I often wondered that, why couldn't they contemplate simply? I mean, the closest that anyone came to that, I think, was probably Van Kougnet, even though he himself in 1875 is on the record saying that $4 is the maximum that you could possibly have under the terms of the Robinson Treaties.
Yeah, that's after Mr. Blake gives his opinion, so we've got to be careful.
Yeah, so
Right.
in any event, what I'm saying is that we need to take all of this historical context into consideration in terms of the thinking that went on.
But-
I agree with your point fully. I have no problem with the main thrust of this section of your cross-examination, and that is these kinds of petitions and letters did not always result in government action. They should, at the very least, have responded, even if the response may not have been what the First Nations wanted to hear, but they should certainly have responded, and they should have.
And I'm going to suggest to you, sorry, did you want to say anything further?
No, go ahead.
I'm going to suggest to you, sir, that if it were true that the Crown in 1875, after 1875, was interested in treating the various treaty bands the same, they would have raised the Robinson Superior Treaty to at least $5.
Yes, I would agree with you that that's what should have happened under their.
I'm going to suggest,
But by their own thinking, and I think that is why Pennefather talked about, how this was not a good treaty at all. It was shackled by stipulations, as he put it.
well, Pennefather didn't know about the 1873 treaties or Treaty 1 through 9.
That is true, but he recognized that at the time when he was writing, it wasn't even close to $4. They were still getting, 90 cents or $1.60 at most.
All right, but I'm trying to talk about, I'm suggesting to you, sir, that your hypothesis that the Crown was interested in parity is not true, because one, they didn't do anything about it. Would you agree with that?
I agree that they did not raise it to $5. And that is,
Proof that, that is proof that they did not have parity in mind in respect of the Robinson treaties,
well,
correct?
bearing in mind, of course, that Treaty 9 is also $4. So.
Treaty 9 wasn't until 1906, you said.
1905.
1905, you said. So we've got a period of, what, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, in that case, paradoxically, the parity is actually working in reverse. It's the Robinson Treaty precedent that set the Treaty 9 $4, whereas the standard rate prior to Treaty 9 had been $5. Originally, it was $3. Treaties 1 and 2 were originally $3, but then they changed that and made it $5. So 5 became the standard. And with Treaty 9, they reverted back to $4. So what you have is basically a.
What you have is not parity.
Uh,
Is that
Yes, no.
sort of the conclusion to all of this?
Yes,
It's not parity, but it's within the ballpark. What it is not is this sort of situation where you've got all these fixed treaties, pre-Confederation, pre-1850. Then you have the Robinson Treaty, and then after that, you've got fixed treaties all the way along that are more or less in the $3 to $5 range. And if you think of Robinson.
not $3 to $5 range. It was raised very quickly to $5 in Treaty 1 and 2, I believe.
In 1875.
Yeah.
it was raised to $5.
but not for the Robinson Superior. And
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, that's,
there
Right.
was no effort at parity, is my point. Do you agree?
there was no effort at parity in the, once the treaty, the number treaty system had a $5 annuity in place, there was no effort to have the Robinson Treaty meet that same standard. Yes.
All right. And going from $4 to $5, although it is might not seem like much, it is a 25% increase, right?
Yes, I'm not suggesting it's not a significant amount.
I'm sure there's any number of public service people who would like a 25% increase today.
I'm- Some of them are on strike for that very reason.
Uh-huh. Well, let's,
Can I just warn you both? Justifying an interpretation of the treaty that puts a max cap of $4 on it is not what we're doing in stage 3.
that's right.
And so anytime there's an opportunity for you to justify that interpretation, sir, I would like you to do your best to remember what we're doing here. Okay, so
Yes.
these questions are about Crown actions, but adding to, or as often as happens, adding to your answer with a justification for the $4 is not helpful. These are long days as it is, and there are issues that we're not dealing with in this stage.
Thank you. So you asked whether the concerns in tab 18, which is the January 9th, 1884 skiing to Superintendent in General, was followed up, and you'll see at page 113, there's a suggestion about perhaps writing to Mr. O'Brien, MP from Muskoka. In the
Yes.
middle of the page.
Yes,
And if you look at the very next tab, tab 19 of, you've got a letter that Mr. James sends to Mr. O'Brien.
yes,
And about 3/4 of the way down, he says, the government should carefully consider the increase from $4, as we are all aware that a large revenue is derived annually.
yes,
And I'm going to suggest to you that this is asking for more than $4 and that there's no follow-up to it. Would you agree?
I would say yes to the first question, and I have no knowledge to respond to the second question.
Let's move to tab 20. Tab 20 is a transcription of trial exhibit 1-1204 from phase 1. It is a letter from Van Cugnet to
Yes.
O'Brien, dated February 5, 1884. And again, this is referring to Chief Solomon James' letter of 14th ultimo.
Yes,
And at the bottom on item number 2, the chief referring to the condition in the said treaty in regard to the amount of annuity to be received by the Indians for the land ceded, that they should receive an amount not to exceed of $4 per head, or such further sum as Her Majesty may be graciously pleased to order, expresses the opinion that as a large revenue is derived annually from the territory ceded to the Crown under said treaty, the government should carefully consider the propriety of further increasing the annuity payable to the Indians.
yes,
And Van Cugnet then says over on page 118, it will be remembered that the annuity paid the Indians but a few years ago did not amount to $2 per head, whereas it has been of late years increased to $4. It would appear to be premature, therefore, to move for a further increase at the present time. Now, this is a response. It's the only one I've been able to find. But do you know where Van Cugnet got this idea that it would be premature? I can't find any reference to who gave him instructions to suggest that it's premature.
Yeah, it's puzzling to begin with because Van Couvenot himself is on the record in 1875 of saying that it can't go beyond $4. He makes it absolutely clear. So at some point, he has come to, by the 1880s, he has come to believe that it is in fact possible, but premature. How he came to that belief, I have no idea.
All right. And then Van Couvenot seems to be a persistent guy because he follows up on it a couple of years later. I guess it's now June 9, 1893.
Yes,
And he writes to Newcomb. And this is at tab 21, page 123 of the compendium.
yes.
I'm almost done for the day. This is stage 1 trial exhibit 1-1334. And he writes in the middle of the first paragraph, I think it is well that attention should be called to the condition mentioned in both of the above treaties in regard to the annuities, which may be paid to the Indians. He then reads from it, and over on page 124, he says, in the middle of the page, the department has for some years past paid the Indians under these treaties $4 per capita, the amount necessary to enable it to do so having been voted annually by Parliament. But it is considered that owing to the immense revenue derived from the sales of land and timber within the territory ceded by the Indians under the above treaties to the Crown, the amount of annuity might fairly be increased to such further sum as Her Majesty may be pleased to order. The reference to graciousness is left out, but I don't know that we can take anything from that. Do you think? Is it meaningful that he didn't use the word gracious?
I don't know whether that's meaningful or not. All I know is that it's quite inconsistent with what he said in 1875.
But we do know that Newcomb responds, and if you look at tab 22,
Well, just before you go on, I just want to read the rest of it.
okay.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me that he refers to the diminution clause in the Robinson treaties. But he doesn't think that is preventative to their receiving such further increased sum as Her Majesty may be graciously pleased to order. That's
Okay.
where he does. And I only point out here that, he's the successor to Sprague, and Sprague had an entirely different understanding. He thought that the diminution clause was very important because it provided the population base for the annuity. And as such, Sprague ended up using the population as
A time of treaty.
a time of treaty.
Yes. Can we say that Sprague doesn't seem to have been given the Anishinaabe the benefit of the doubt?
In that instance, Laird gave them the benefit of the doubt, not Sprague.
Yes, indeed. In any event, what I was trying to finish off on was Newcomb's response, where he writes on June 1893, June 19th, 1893, he writes back to Van Couvenot and says, the point to which you refer will not be lost sight of. though it is very questionable whether the provision in these treaties to which you refer can be made the basis of any legal claim against the province of Canada. Now, whatever may have happened, would you agree with me that it was lost sight of? I don't see any follow-up on any increase. This is the end of the trail.
Well, he's the Minister of Justice, and he thinks by the very subject line that he has on his letter, that this is in relation to the arbitration, which of course was dealing with the arrears question. And so he thinks basically that we can't really contemplate. Remember, he's not the Minister of Indian Affairs. He's the Minister of Justice, or Deputy Minister of Justice. But he says, you know, we cannot contemplate a change in annuities if it's going to impact the calculation of arrears that is needed for the legal claim against the province of Canada.
My only point, Dr. Von Gernert, is the point about an increase beyond $4, to which Newcomb says would not be lost sight of,
Yeah.
was in fact, in truth, historically lost sight of. Is that fair?
Yeah, I have not seen any documentation, and if you haven't provided any in subsequent tabs, then I'd agree with you.
Thank you. I think that would be good for a day.
Thank you. Let me just catch up my notes. Okay. We'll break for the day. Yeah.
All rise.